The sound of metal clanging echoed through the small garage as David Monroe wiped his hands on a rag, finishing up with an old Chevy's engine. The smell of oil and grease filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of fresh coffee Sarah had brought him earlier that morning. He was a mechanic through and through, hands roughened by years of hard work, eyes calm yet distant, as if looking at something far beyond the rows of cars waiting to be fixed. This was his life, and for the most part, he was content. His focus, though, wasn't just on cars. It was on his 7-year-old daughter, Emily, who sat not far from him, legs swinging from the stool where she colored in a picture. Her blonde hair fell in loose waves, framing a face full of curiosity. She had the brightest green eyes that always seemed to be asking questions, even when she was silent. "Dad." Emily's small voice broke the quiet between engine roars. She didn't even look up from her drawing, though he could feel the seriousness in her tone. "What was your dad like?" David's hand froze for a split second before he resumed wiping the wrench, his movements slower. He had heard this question before, many times. He never had a real answer. "I don't remember much about him, he replied, his voice steady but with an undertone of sadness. "It was a long time ago." That's what he always said. Emily frowned, her brow furrowing as she carefully colored in the sun on her paper. "But don't you remember anything? Like, did he teach you how to fix cars? Or did he take you to baseball games?" David sighed, leaning against the workbench and looking at his daughter, feeling the same twinge of frustration he did every time she asked about his past. "No, sweetheart. I don't remember those kinds of things." He avoided her eyes, reaching for another tool to busy his hands. The truth was, David had no clear memories of his childhood. He remembered small flashes, random images, the scent of something familiar, and sometimes a strange sound that haunted his dreams. But nothing that could make sense of where he came from or who his family was. All he knew was that one day he had shown up at a foster home when he was 7, with no one claiming to be his family. The years before that? Gone. It was as if they had been erased. "Dad," Emily called again, and this time he couldn't avoid her gaze. Those green eyes looked at him, not with disappointment, but with genuine curiosity. "It's okay," she said, her voice softer. "I just want to know about you." He felt a lump form in his throat, but he forced a smile. "I know, Em. Maybe one day I'll remember." Emily nodded and went back to her drawing, the sound of her crayons scratching the paper filling the quiet between them. David felt a familiar weight pressing on his chest. He wasn't just hiding the fact that he didn't remember his past. He was hiding the fear that something darker was lurking in those forgotten years. As the sun set and the garage grew quieter, Emily's babysitter, Sarah, arrived. She was a close friend, almost like family, who helped him care for Emily while he worked late. Sarah walked in, her red hair pulled back into a ponytail, greeting them with a warm smile. "Ready to go, Em?" she asked, brushing off some of the dust that had settled on her jeans from the garage. "Almost done," Emily chirped, holding up her half-finished masterpiece. It was a drawing of a family, David, Emily, and someone who looked like a mother, though she had never known hers. David glanced at the drawing and felt another pang of guilt. "You did good, kiddo," he said, ruffling her hair. As they packed up to leave, Sarah lingered by the door, giving David a concerned look. "You doing okay?" she asked, keeping her voice low so Emily wouldn't hear. David nodded, but Sarah wasn't convinced. She had known him long enough to see through his walls. "If you ever need to talk, you know I'm here, right?" David gave her a small, appreciative smile. "I know. Thanks, Sarah." As he watched them walk away, Emily's laughter echoing through the street, David leaned back against the doorframe, staring into the fading light. He couldn't shake the nagging thought that his past, the one he had buried so deep, might not stay hidden forever. The ballroom buzzed with chatter and the soft clinking of glasses. A live jazz band played in the background, their smooth notes drifting over the crowd of well-dressed guests. The annual charity event was one of the biggest social gatherings in the small town, attracting local business owners, wealthy donors, and families looking to give back. The chandeliers above glittered like stars, casting a warm glow across the room. Emily Monroe, wearing a little blue dress, spun around excitedly on the ballroom floor. She twirled with the carefree joy of a 7-year-old, her laughter mixing with the music as she danced near the buffet table. Her babysitter, Sarah, kept a watchful eye on her while chatting with a few acquaintances from the town. This wasn't the kind of place David normally attended, but he had been invited by one of the car dealership owners he did repairs for, and it seemed like a good opportunity for Emily to enjoy a special night out. As Emily danced, her hand occasionally brushed against the small chain around her neck, drawing her attention back to the old family watch her dad had given her that morning to wear for the event. It was a simple, aged timepiece, nothing fancy, but it meant the world to her. David had told her it was one of the few things he had from his childhood, a piece of the past he barely remembered. Across the room, Logan Bennett was sipping a glass of red wine, engaging in polite conversation with some local dignitaries. Logan was a name everyone in town knew. One of the wealthiest men in the area, his face regularly appeared in business magazines and charity boards. Tall, with sharp features softened by years of living in luxury, Logan moved with an air of control and confidence, the kind of man who could command attention without needing to raise his voice. But that night, his focus wasn't on business deals or donations. His eyes drifted across the room, casually scanning the faces, when they landed on something unexpected. It wasn't a person or a detail of the event. It was a watch. The watch. At first, Logan thought it was a trick of the light, some illusion created by the glimmering chandeliers. But no, it was unmistakable. The old, silver watch Emily wore around her neck wasn't just any timepiece. It was a near mirror image of one he had seen many years ago, a watch that had belonged to his twin brother, a brother who had been kidnapped at birth, a shadow of a memory that haunted his family ever since. His breath hitched. He quickly excused himself from the conversation, his polite smile fading as he crossed the ballroom, his gaze locked on the small girl spinning in circles. Each time her dress swirled, the watch bounced on its chain, catching the light again. "Excuse me," Logan said softly as he approached Sarah, trying not to alarm her. His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable intensity behind his words. "That's a lovely watch your daughter is wearing." Sarah, taken aback by the man's sudden approach, smiled politely. "Oh, thank you. But she's not my daughter. I'm her babysitter. It's actually a watch her father gave her. An old family piece, I believe." Logan's heart raced, but he kept his expression composed. "It's an antique, isn't it? May I?" He motioned toward the watch, but Sarah instinctively stepped in front of Emily, her protective instincts kicking in. Something about Logan's sudden interest didn't sit right with her. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her tone wary now. Logan realized he was coming on too strong. He softened his approach, holding up his hands in a calming gesture. No, I apologize if I startled you. It's just, that watch looks exactly like one that used to belong to my family. It's been missing for years." Sarah's brow furrowed in confusion. "Missing? I'm sorry, but David, Emily's father, has had this watch for as long as I've known him." "David?" Logan asked, his mind racing. The name wasn't familiar, but something about this felt too coincidental. "I see. Would you mind telling me a little more about him?" Sarah hesitated, feeling an odd tension in the air. She glanced down at Emily, who was now distracted by a tower of cupcakes near the dessert table, blissfully unaware of the conversation. "David's a mechanic here in town. He's quiet, keeps to himself mostly, but he's a good man." "Why do you ask?" Logan's heart pounded in his chest. A mechanic, a family watch. The pieces began to fit together in a way that both excited and terrified him. Could it be? He looked past Sarah for a moment, watching Emily as she happily licked the frosting from her fingers, her innocence stark against the weight of what Logan was beginning to realize. "I think I need to meet him," Logan said, his voice quiet but firm. Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. "Why? What is this really about?" Logan was silent for a long moment. His mind flashed back to the stories his mother had told him, how his twin brother had been taken from the hospital the night they were born, how they had searched for years, following dead-end leads and false hopes, a grief that had shaped his family, one that still lingered like a dark cloud. "I believe David might be my brother." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and disorienting. Sarah blinked, trying to process what she had just heard. Your brother? I know it sounds insane, Logan interrupted, trying to keep his voice steady. But I can't shake this feeling. That watch. It belonged to my brother, the one who disappeared when we were infants. Sarah glanced over at Emily, who was still completely unaware of the conversation, then back at Logan. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the desperation of a man who had just discovered a piece of a life he thought he'd lost forever. Look, Logan continued, lowering his voice, I don't want to alarm anyone, but I need to speak with David. Please, let me meet him. Sarah hesitated, glancing at her phone. David's at the garage right now. I can ask him if he wants to talk. Logan nodded, feeling the weight of years pressing down on him. Please do. As Sarah stepped aside to make the call, Logan stood there, watching Emily once more, his heart pounding with the hope and fear that the man who had unknowingly raised her might just be the brother he had spent his whole life searching for. David stood in his garage, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the tools and car parts scattered around, giving the space a quiet, almost eerie calm. He had just finished a tune-up on an old truck, its owner due any minute to pick it up. The hum of a radio played softly in the background, a familiar comfort amid the solitude. As he closed the hood of the truck, the buzz of his phone vibrating on the workbench cut through the air. David glanced at the screen. It was Sarah. He wiped his hands on a rag and answered, his voice tired but warm. Hey, everything okay? He asked, expecting her to say that Emily had spilled something or was ready to head home. There was a brief pause on the other end before Sarah's voice came through, lower and more serious than usual. David, are you free for a minute? I think you should come down to the charity event. David frowned, wiping more sweat from his neck as his muscles tensed. Why? Did something happen with Emily? No. Emily's fine. It's just, there's someone here who really wants to meet you. It's important. David's brow furrowed deeper. Someone? What are you talking about, Sarah? There was another pause before she finally said, It's a man named Logan Bennett. He says he thinks you might be his brother. David froze, feeling the weight of those words hit him like a sledgehammer. His mind immediately rejected the idea. It didn't make sense. He didn't have a brother. At least, none that he knew of. His childhood memories were still a blur, distant fragments that didn't fit together. But now, a stranger was claiming something so outrageous, so impossible, that David couldn't even respond. David? Sarah's voice brought him back. Did you hear me? He says. He really believes you're his twin brother. David swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. His heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to form a coherent response. Sarah, that's not possible. I don't know him. I understand, Sarah said gently. But he's serious, David. He recognized the watch you gave Emily. He says it belonged to his family, and I don't know, but he seems convinced. I think it's worth talking to him. David's eyes instinctively dropped to his wrist, where the empty space where the watch usually sat suddenly felt glaring. That old watch, he had never really thought much of it. It was just something he had found with his things when he was placed in foster care. It was a relic, a piece of a past he had no connection to. But now, it seemed like that small object had a much bigger meaning. I don't know, Sarah. I don't know who this guy is, David muttered, pacing the garage floor as anxiety bubbled inside him. I get it, Sarah replied, her voice calm, steady. But I wouldn't ask if I didn't think this was important. He's not pushing or trying to force anything. He just wants to talk. Please, just come down for a few minutes. David stood there, gripping the phone so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He had never been the type to entertain wild ideas or entertain possibilities that didn't make sense. But something in Sarah's voice told him this wasn't just some random encounter. If there was even a shred of truth to it, he needed to know. All right, David finally said, his voice low. I'll come. The drive to the charity event felt like a blur. David barely registered the streets or the familiar turns as his mind swirled with questions. The possibility that he had a brother, someone who had been out there all along, gnawed at him. What if this Logan guy was right? What if the reason David couldn't remember his past was because something had been taken from him, something more than just memories? When he arrived at the venue, the grand ballroom looked imposing, so far removed from the oil-stained world of the garage. He parked his truck in the side lot, taking a deep breath before stepping out. Every step toward the entrance felt heavier than the last. Inside, the lively music and chatter seemed distant as David scanned the room, searching for Sarah or Emily. And then he saw him, Logan Bennett. He was tall, well-dressed, standing near the edge of the room, watching the entrance. When their eyes met, David felt an odd, unsettling sensation in the pit of his stomach. There was something about Logan that felt familiar, as if he had seen him before in a dream or a fragmented memory that had long since faded. Sarah appeared at David's side, quietly guiding him toward where Logan stood, Emily trailing behind her with a cupcake in hand, unaware of the tension surrounding the adults. Logan stepped forward, his eyes never leaving David's face. The two men stood there for a long moment, both sizing each other up, the weight of unspoken questions hanging thick in the air. "I'm Logan," the man finally said, extending his hand. His voice was calm, but carried an unmistakable intensity. David hesitated before shaking his hand, feeling a strange sense of déjà vu. "David." The handshake lingered for a beat too long, both men trying to find something in the other's face, something that would confirm or deny what Logan had come to believe. The silence was broken when Logan spoke again, his voice quieter, almost hesitant. "You look so much like me," he said, his gaze unwavering. "I know this is insane, but I think you're my brother." David's throat tightened. I don't know anything about that. I don't remember much of my childhood at all." Logan nodded, clearly aware of the difficulty of the conversation. "I know this is a lot to take in. I didn't believe it at first either. But then I saw the watch. The one your daughter was wearing." David glanced down at Emily, who had returned to her drawings, completely oblivious to the storm brewing around her. The watch, that damn watch. It had always been a symbol of mystery for David, something that connected him to a past he could never reach. Logan took a breath, pulling out his own phone and swiping through pictures. He stopped on an old, worn photograph of a baby boy, two boys, identical twins, lying side by side in a hospital crib. "This is me and my brother. We were born together, but he was kidnapped the night we were born. My parents searched for years, but we never found him." David stared at the photograph, his heart pounding in his chest. The faces of the babies in the picture looked eerily familiar, and a strange sensation washed over him, like a long-lost part of himself was waking up. "I don't remember any of this," David said, his voice barely above a whisper, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "You don't have to," Logan said softly, his eyes pleading, "but we can figure this out together. I'm not here to disrupt your life. I just need to know if you're my brother. I've been looking for you my whole life." David stood there, torn between disbelief and a growing sense that maybe, just maybe, this man was telling the truth. His past had always been a blank slate, a mystery he never dared to solve. But now, standing in front of Logan, with the photo of those two boys staring up at him, he felt that mystery closing in, whether he was ready for it or not. I don't know what to say," David whispered, his voice shaky. Logan stepped forward, his hand resting gently on David's shoulder. "You don't have to say anything right now. Just let me help you find out the truth." The drive back to David's small house was silent, filled only with the soft hum of the car engine. Emily sat in the back seat, her eyes half closed from exhaustion. In the front seat, Sarah occasionally glanced sideways at David, who seemed miles away, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "You okay?" Sarah asked quietly, breaking the silence. David's jaw was clenched, his eyes focused on the road. "I don't know, Sarah. I really don't." As they pulled into the driveway, the weight of the conversation from earlier still lingered heavily in the air. The house, small and modest, had always been a place of safety for David and Emily. Tonight, it felt like a place of uncertainty, filled with questions waiting for answers. David stepped out of the car, his body tense, while Sarah helped a sleepy Emily out of the back seat. "Can Logan come inside?" Emily asked, her voice a sleepy mumble. David paused, not sure how to respond. It was strange how quickly Emily had grown fond of Logan. She had chatted with him as if they'd known each other forever. But it wasn't just Emily. David had felt something too, a strange pull toward Logan, a sense of familiarity he couldn't explain. "Sure," David finally said, trying to sound steady. "Come on in." Logan nodded silently, following them inside. The moment he stepped into the living room, his eyes roamed over the simple decorations, the framed pictures of Emily on the wall. There were no baby photos of David, nothing from his childhood. "I see you've made a good life here," Logan said softly, his tone almost reverent. David nodded, unsure of how to respond. "It's just me and Emily. We've managed." As Sarah led Emily to her bedroom, David and Logan sat awkwardly in the living room, the atmosphere tense and filled with unspoken questions. It was clear that Logan had so much he wanted to ask, but he seemed to be struggling to find the right words. Finally, it was David who spoke first. "Look, I don't know how any of this makes sense. I don't even remember having a family before foster care. And now you're telling me we're brothers?" Logan's eyes were earnest, his voice low but intense. "I know it's hard to believe, but there's too much that lines up. The watch, the resemblance, even the fact that you don't remember anything before a certain age. My family's tried everything to find you. I never stopped searching." David felt the weight of Logan's words, the sincerity of a man who had spent his whole life searching for something he couldn't let go of. It was overwhelming. "But how can you be sure?" he asked, almost desperately. "What if this is just some bizarre coincidence?" Logan reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, worn piece of paper. It was a birth certificate, David's birth certificate. He handed it to David with trembling hands. "This was the only thing we found that night. It was hidden under the mattress of the hospital crib, left behind when you were taken." David's eyes scanned the paper, the words blurring as he tried to process what he was seeing. His name was there, the date of birth matching his own. But what caught his attention most was the line-marked mother's name, Elizabeth Bennett. He looked up at Logan, confusion and disbelief clouding his expression. "This can't be real," he whispered. "It is," Logan insisted. "Our mother never stopped hoping you'd be found. This is why I couldn't just let it go, David. I needed to find you for her, for both of us." David's mind was spinning, his heart pounding painfully in his chest. All his life, he had been searching for answers, answers that now seemed to be staring him right in the face. I don't know who I am anymore," he admitted, his voice raw and exposed. Logan leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "You're my brother. That's who you are. And I want to help you remember, to fill in the gaps that you lost." The words hit David hard, stirring up memories he didn't know he had. Flashes of a hospital room, distant sounds of a lullaby, a woman's soft voice, things he had buried deep, memories that now bubbled to the surface. It was overwhelming, like a dam breaking after years of holding back a flood. Tears welled up in David's eyes, but he quickly wiped them away, not wanting to appear weak in front of a man he barely knew but somehow felt deeply connected to. "I don't know how to deal with this," he admitted, his voice cracking. Logan reached out, placing a hand on David's shoulder, his grip firm but comforting. "We deal with it together. You're not alone anymore, David. Not ever again." Before David could respond, a small voice cut through the heavy silence. "Dad." Emily stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with confusion. She had been listening, her innocent mind struggling to comprehend the gravity of the situation. David turned toward her, his heart aching at the uncertainty in her eyes. "Hey, Em. Everything's okay. We're just talking." Emily looked from David to Logan, then back to David. "Is he really your brother?" David felt a lump in his throat, unsure of how to explain this to a 7-year-old. "We think so, sweetheart. We're not sure yet, but we're trying to figure it out." Emily tilted her head, her green eyes searching his face for reassurance. "Does that mean I have an uncle?" The innocence of her question broke the tension, and Logan couldn't help but smile. "Yes, Emily," he said gently. "If this is true, then I would be your uncle." Emily's face lit up with excitement, a wide smile spreading across her face. "I've always wanted an uncle," she exclaimed, running over to Logan and hugging his leg. The sudden warmth of the embrace took Logan by surprise, but he quickly recovered, kneeling down to hug her back. David watched the scene, a mix of emotions swirling inside him. It was all too much, too fast. But in that moment, seeing Emily's joy and Logan's hopeful expression, he felt a small glimmer of something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. As the night wore on, the three of them talked more, filling the quiet house with stories and questions. Logan shared tales of their mother, describing her as a kind, strong woman who had never given up hope of finding her lost son. David listened intently, trying to piece together the puzzle of his past. But amid the hope, there was still a lingering darkness, a sense of unfinished business. The more Logan spoke, the more David felt a gnawing fear. A fear that the truth wasn't just about their reunion, but also about the circumstances that had led to their separation. The kidnapping, the missing years, and the question of who had taken David in the first place. As they prepared to call it a night, David couldn't shake the feeling that finding Logan was just the beginning. He looked at his newfound brother, his voice steady but filled with determination. "If we're going to do this, Logan, we're going to find out everything. I need to know the whole truth, no matter what." Logan nodded, a look of fierce resolve in his eyes. "I wouldn't have it any other way." The following morning was gray and overcast, matching the mood inside David's small kitchen. Logan sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, his eyes fixed on the swirling steam as if searching for answers in its patterns. Across from him, David leaned back in his chair, his face a mix of exhaustion and determination. The air was thick with the unspoken realization that their reunion, as miraculous as it seemed, was far from complete. There were still more questions than answers. Emily sat at the table too, quietly munching on her cereal, her bright eyes darting back and forth between the two men. She sensed the seriousness in the air, but couldn't quite grasp its full meaning. "So, what are we doing today?" she asked, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. David and Logan exchanged a look before David cleared his throat. "I need to take some time to think, Em," he said gently. "Uncle Logan and I have some things to figure out." Emily nodded, but her curiosity was still bubbling over. "Are you going to find out why you got lost?" she asked, her question blunt but innocent. David's chest tightened at her words. "Yes, sweetheart," he said, reaching across the table to ruffle her hair. "That's exactly what we're going to try to do." By midday, Sarah arrived to pick up Emily, sensing that David and Logan needed space to pursue their investigation. As soon as they were alone, David turned to Logan, his voice filled with urgency. "We need to find out who took me, Logan. If someone went through that much trouble to separate us, there's got to be more to this." Logan nodded. "I've already started digging into the records," he said, pulling out a small notebook filled with notes and names. "The hospital where we were born still has some archived records. I know a private investigator who can help us get more details." David frowned, his skepticism rising. "How much do you actually know? Are we sure these records are even reliable after all this time?" Logan met his gaze head-on. "It's all we've got right now, David. I know it's a lot to take in, but we have to start somewhere." David exhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had always been a man of action, fixing cars, solving problems with his hands. But this was a problem he couldn't just repair with a wrench. It was messier, more personal. "All right," David said finally. "Let's go see what we can find." They arrived at a small office building on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that seemed to blend into the background. The private investigator Logan had mentioned was a middle-aged woman named Claire Matthews, a no-nonsense type with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Her office was cluttered with files, old coffee cups, and a faint smell of cigarette smoke. "So," Claire began as she shuffled through some papers, "Logan told me about your situation. I pulled what I could from the hospital's records, but it's slim. Most of it's been redacted or lost over the years. But there's one lead that stands out." David leaned forward, his eyes focused. "What is it?" Claire slid a file across the desk, flipping it open to reveal a faded photograph of a woman in a nurse's uniform. "Her name is Margaret Daniels. She was on duty the night you were taken. But here's where it gets interesting." She disappeared shortly after that night. No record of her since. David's stomach churned. You think she was involved? It's possible, Claire replied. She's the only name that appears repeatedly in the old reports, and there's no trace of her after the incident. Either she went into hiding, or someone made her disappear. Logan clenched his jaw, his voice low. If she's still alive, we need to find her. David nodded, his determination hardening. We need to know what she knows. Over the next few days, Logan and David immersed themselves in the investigation. They traced Margaret Daniels' past, uncovering scattered details about her life before the disappearance. She had no known family, a sparse work history, and an address that led them to a small, abandoned house on the outskirts of town. The house was decrepit, its windows boarded up and the front yard overgrown with weeds. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. David's heart raced as he and Logan approached the front door, the air filled with the musty scent of decay. They tried the door, and to their surprise, it creaked open. Inside, the house was a mess. Old newspapers, broken furniture, and dust covered every surface. It was clear no one had lived there for a long time. But as they moved through the dimly lit rooms, Logan's eyes caught something. A small stack of papers on a table near the back. He picked them up, quickly scanning through them. David, he said, his voice urgent. Look at this. David moved closer, his eyes narrowing as he read the papers. They were birth certificates, including one with his name. But there was something else. Documents related to the Bennett family, details that only someone close to the family could know. It was clear that Margaret Daniels had been deeply involved, not just in the hospital but in the Bennett's lives. This wasn't just a random kidnapping, Logan said, his voice filled with a mix of anger and disbelief. This was planned. Someone wanted you out of the family, David. David's mind raced. Who would have gone to such lengths? And why? Suddenly, they heard a noise outside, footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway. Both men turned, adrenaline surging through them. David instinctively reached for a wrench he'd grabbed from his truck earlier, while Logan moved toward the window, peering cautiously through the dirty glass. A black SUV was parked in front of the house, and two men in suits stepped out, their movements calculated and precise. They had an air of authority about them, but it wasn't the friendly kind. David's heart pounded as the men approached the house, one of them pulling out a gun. Logan, David whispered, we've got to go. Now. Logan nodded, his face set with grim determination. They moved quickly, exiting through a back door that led into the overgrown backyard. As they made their way through the weeds, David could hear the men inside the house, their voices low but urgent. We can't let them find us, Logan said under his breath. Whoever they are, they're not here for a friendly chat. David felt a surge of anger, his confusion now mixed with a fierce need to protect not just himself, but also Emily. We'll figure this out, he said, his voice steady. But we need to be smart about it. As they slipped through the back gate, David glanced back at the house one last time. The danger was real now, not just a distant mystery. Whoever had orchestrated his kidnapping all those years ago was still out there, still trying to keep the truth buried. And now, it wasn't just David and Logan at risk, it was everyone they cared about. Later that night, back at David's house, the gravity of their situation hit them both hard. Emily had fallen asleep, blissfully unaware of the escalating danger, but David and Logan sat at the kitchen table, their faces etched with exhaustion and fear. They're not going to stop, are they? David asked, his voice low. No, Logan replied, his tone resolute. But neither will we. David nodded, feeling a strange sense of clarity amid the chaos. The truth was closer than ever, but so were the threats. As he looked across the table at his brother, he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't let anyone take away what he had found, not again. We're in this together, Logan, he said firmly. No matter what. Logan's eyes held a fierce determination. Always. David's house was eerily quiet. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint creaking of floorboards as Logan paced back and forth. David sat at the kitchen table, his head buried in his hands, trying to make sense of everything that had unfolded. The discovery of Margaret Daniels' involvement, the mysterious documents, and the men who had shown up at the abandoned house. All of it pointed to a web of deception that was far more dangerous than they'd imagined. Suddenly, Logan's phone buzzed loudly, shattering the silence. He quickly pulled it from his pocket, his brow furrowing as he read the message. "It's Claire," he said, his voice tense. "She found something. We need to meet her at her office." David looked up, his eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion, but still burning with determination. "Let's go." When they arrived at Claire's office, the atmosphere was charged with urgency. Claire was waiting for them, her face serious as she spread out a set of documents on her desk. "I've been digging deeper," she began, pointing to a series of names highlighted on one of the pages. "It's not just about the kidnapping, David. This goes much deeper. There are people, powerful people, who benefited from your disappearance." David felt a chill run down his spine. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice a mix of anger and fear. Claire hesitated, glancing at Logan before continuing. "It's not just one person, David. It's a group connected to the Bennett family's business empire. When you were taken, someone stood to gain control of a significant share of the family's wealth." Logan's face darkened. "Are you saying this was all about money?" "Money and power," Claire confirmed. "The timing of the kidnapping coincided with a major shift in the family business. It looks like someone orchestrated your disappearance to secure their own position." David felt a surge of rage, his fists clenching at his sides. "Who would do that to a child?" Claire looked him in the eye. "There's one name that keeps coming up, Victor Grayson. He was a business partner of the Bennetts back then, but his ties to the family were deeper than just business. He had access to the family's personal affairs and enough influence to cover his tracks." Logan's expression was a mix of anger and disbelief. "Victor Grayson? He's still a major player in the business world. But how do we prove it?" Claire shook her head. "It won't be easy. He's well connected, and if he's been involved all this time, he's likely got people watching you now. He'll do whatever it takes to keep the past buried." David's mind raced. Victor Grayson, a name he had never heard before, yet it now represented the man who had torn his life apart. "If he's behind this," David said, his voice low and determined, "then he's not going to stop until we're silenced too." Claire's eyes were grim. "That's exactly why you need to be careful. Whoever sent those men to the abandoned house won't hesitate to use force. This is about more than just your past now. It's about your safety and Emily's." Later that evening, David and Logan returned home, both feeling the weight of their newfound enemy. As they approached the front door, David felt a familiar sense of dread. He scanned the quiet street, his instincts sharpened by the fear that someone could be watching them. "Do you think they're out there right now?" David asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Logan glanced around before answering. "Probably. But that doesn't mean we stop." Inside, they found Emily playing with her dolls, completely unaware of the danger lurking outside. The sight of her innocence struck David like a punch to the gut. He couldn't let anything happen to her, not after everything they had been through. "Emily," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, "how about you sleep in my room tonight?" Emily looked up, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "Is something wrong, Daddy?" David forced a smile, kneeling down to her level. "No, sweetheart. I just want you close to me, okay?" Emily nodded, still a bit confused, but she trusted her father completely. "Okay." Later that night, David and Logan sat in the dimly lit living room, the weight of the situation settling over them like a heavy blanket. Logan stared out the window, his eyes searching the darkness for any sign of movement. "We can't let our guard down, David," he said quietly. David nodded, his face hardening with resolve. "I know, but we also need a plan. We can't just sit here waiting for them to come to us." Logan's eyes flickered with an idea. "We need to draw them out. If we can get someone from Grayson's side to talk, we might have a chance." David considered the suggestion, his mind working through the risks. "But how do we do that? We don't even know who we can trust." Logan's face was set with determination. "We create a diversion, something that makes them think we're closer to the truth than we are. It'll force them to react, maybe even make a mistake." David's instincts told him it was a dangerous gamble, but it was the only option that made sense. "Then let's do it," he agreed. The following day, Logan put the plan into motion. He used his connections in the business world to leak a rumor that David had obtained new evidence linking Victor Grayson to the kidnapping. It was a risky move, but one that could potentially force Grayson's hand. By late afternoon, the response was swift. A black car pulled up across the street from David's house, and two men stepped out, both wearing dark suits and sunglasses. They looked around cautiously before approaching the front door. David's heart pounded in his chest as he watched from the window. "They're here," he whispered. Logan nodded, his expression tense. "Stay calm. This is what we wanted." The men knocked on the door, their knocks loud and deliberate. David opened the door slowly, keeping his face neutral. "Can I help you?" One of the men, a tall figure with a cold, unreadable face, spoke first. "We need to talk, Mr. Monroe. It's about the information you have." David felt a surge of adrenaline, but he kept his voice steady. "What information are you talking about?" The man's eyes were hard, his tone sharp. "You know exactly what we mean. Now, let's not make this difficult." Logan stepped forward, his presence commanding. "If you have something to say, you can say it here." The second man reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small envelope. "This is a warning," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Back off, or there will be consequences." David's blood boiled, but he forced himself to remain calm. "And if we don't?" The man's lips curled into a thin smile. "Then you'll find out just how serious Mr. Grayson is about keeping things quiet." Logan's eyes blazed with anger. "We're not afraid of Grayson. Tell him that." The men exchanged a glance before stepping back. "Just remember, you've been warned," the first man said as they turned and walked back to the car. David closed the door, his hands shaking with a mix of fear and fury. "They're not going to stop, are they?" "No," Logan said, his voice filled with determination. "But neither will we." As night fell, David sat on the edge of Emily's bed, watching her sleep. The danger was closer than ever, but so was the truth. He knew that confronting Victor Grayson was a perilous path, but it was one he had to take. For himself, for Logan, and most importantly, for Emily. Downstairs, Logan was busy making calls, gathering more information and planning their next move. David joined him, his face set with a fierce resolve. "We need to finish this," David said firmly. "No more running." Logan looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and exhaustion. Agreed. They both knew the risks, but they also knew that the only way forward was through the fire. And together, they would face whatever came next, no matter how dangerous it might be. The next morning arrived cold and gray, a heavy fog settling over the small town as David and Logan prepared to confront the heart of their past. The weight of the previous night's threats hung in the air, but so did a fierce resolve. If they were going to expose Victor Grayson's role in David's kidnapping, they would need to do it quickly and decisively. Inside the house, David gathered what little evidence they had. The birth certificate, the hospital records Claire had uncovered, and Margaret Daniels' abandoned papers. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Grayson nervous. "This is it," David said, slipping the documents into a worn leather bag. No turning back. Logan, standing by the window, nodded. His jaw was set, his eyes hard with determination. "We have to end this now, David." David's gaze shifted to the hallway where Emily was playing with her dolls, her innocent laughter filling the air with a warmth that sharply contrasted the tension between the brothers. He walked over and knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I have to go out for a while, Em," he said gently, "but I'll be back soon, okay?" Emily looked up, sensing something serious in her father's eyes. "Are you going to see Uncle Logan's bad guy?" David hesitated for a moment, surprised by her intuition. He forced a reassuring smile. "Yes, but it's nothing you need to worry about. I'll be safe, I promise." Emily nodded, her small hand squeezing his. "Be careful, Daddy." With a final hug, David rose and joined Logan at the door. "Let's finish this," he said. The drive to Grayson's estate was filled with a tense silence. Logan drove, his face a mask of concentration, while David stared out the window, his mind racing with the possibilities of what they were about to uncover. The estate itself was imposing, a sprawling mansion surrounded by tall iron gates and security cameras. It was a stark contrast to David's modest home, a symbol of the power and wealth that had been built at the expense of the truth. "Ready?" Logan asked, pulling up to the gate. David nodded, his hand tightening around the bag. "As I'll ever be." Logan pressed the intercom button, speaking into the cold, metal box. "We're here to see Victor Grayson." There was a brief silence, followed by a curt response. "Mr. Grayson is not expecting visitors." Logan's voice was steady but forceful. "He'll want to see us. Tell him it's about the Monroe case." There was another pause, longer this time. Then, with a metallic click, the gates began to slowly open. "Proceed to the main entrance," the voice instructed. David's heart pounded as they drove up the winding driveway. The mansion loomed larger with each passing second, its grandeur hiding the secrets that had defined David's life. He took a deep breath, steadying himself for what was to come. Inside, they were greeted by two stern-faced security guards who led them down a long hallway lined with paintings and elegant furnishings. Everything about the place exuded power, from the polished marble floors to the ornate chandeliers overhead. At the end of the hallway, they were ushered into a spacious office where Victor Grayson sat behind a large mahogany desk, his expression cool and composed. Grayson was a tall, imposing figure, his silver hair neatly combed, his tailored suit a perfect fit. He looked up with a calculated calmness, as if their visit was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "Ah, the long-lost Monroe," he said, his voice smooth and detached. "I was wondering when you'd finally come to me." David stepped forward, his eyes burning with anger. "You know who I am. You've known all along." Grayson leaned back in his chair, his gaze unwavering. "Yes, I know exactly who you are. But the question is, what do you think you know?" Logan spoke up, his voice cold. "We know you orchestrated David's kidnapping. We have enough evidence to prove you had motive and means." Grayson's lips curled into a faint, condescending smile. "Do you really think you can just waltz in here and accuse me? You have no idea what you're dealing with." David's hands trembled with rage, but he kept his voice steady. "You took everything from me. My family, my identity, my life. And now, I want the truth." Grayson's expression hardened. He rose from his chair, his demeanor shifting from detached arrogance to something darker. "The truth," he repeated slowly. "The truth is, David, you were never supposed to be found." The words hit David like a punch to the gut. He had known it deep down, but hearing it from Grayson's own mouth made it painfully real. "Why?" he demanded. "Why did you do it?" Grayson's gaze was cold, calculating. "Because you were a threat. Your presence complicated everything. The Bennett family's fortune was at stake, and your disappearance ensured that the power remained where it needed to be." Logan's face twisted with anger. "You ruined lives for money and power. You destroyed our family." Grayson's eyes flickered with a hint of amusement. "And you think that changes anything now? The world doesn't care about your tragic little story. It cares about who holds the power, and that's not you." David's voice shook with emotion. "You can't erase the past, Grayson. The truth is out now, and people will know." Grayson's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold determination. "The truth?" he sneered. "The truth is whatever I decide it to be. And if you think you can expose me, you're more naive than I thought." David's anger boiled over. He stepped closer to Grayson, his voice low but filled with conviction. "You can try to bury the truth, but it won't stay hidden forever. I'm going to make sure of that." Grayson's eyes narrowed. "Then I suppose we'll see who wins this game, won't we?" The standoff was interrupted by a sudden noise from outside the office, a loud commotion, followed by the sound of someone shouting. The security guards rushed in, their faces tense. "Sir, we have a situation," one of them said urgently. Grayson's expression darkened. "What now?" But before he could react, Logan took advantage of the distraction, pulling David back toward the hallway. "We need to go, now," he urged, his voice urgent. David hesitated, his eyes still locked on Grayson. "This isn't over," he promised. Grayson's eyes were cold and unyielding. "No, it's just beginning." They managed to escape the estate amidst the confusion, adrenaline still pumping as they raced back to the car. As Logan sped away, David slumped back in his seat, his mind reeling from the confrontation. He didn't deny it, David muttered, almost to himself. He admitted everything. Logan nodded, his grip tight on the steering wheel. We've got him, David. Now we just need to find a way to make it public. David's heart was heavy with the realization that their fight was far from over. But there was also a flicker of hope. Hope that the truth, now fully revealed, could finally lead to justice. Whatever it takes, David said, his voice filled with a fierce resolve. We're going to bring him down. Logan's eyes were filled with the same fire. Together, the days that followed the confrontation with Victor Grayson were filled with a mix of tension, fear, and relentless planning. David and Logan knew that exposing Grayson wouldn't be easy. His influence was vast, his reach long, and his willingness to silence his enemies lethal. But now that they had undeniable proof of his involvement in David's kidnapping, there was no turning back. Logan reached out to every contact he had. Reporters, private investigators, even a few politicians, using every bit of his influence to spread the word discreetly. He knew that a public revelation was the only way to force Grayson's hand. If we can get this to the press, we'll have a shot, Logan said one evening, his voice edged with determination. Once it's out there, he won't be able to control the narrative anymore. David nodded, his eyes burning with the resolve that had kept him going all these years, even without knowing why. We have to make sure it's big enough that he can't bury it. On the morning of the planned expose, the tension was palpable. David and Logan sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of documents, phone numbers, and hastily scribbled notes. The old watch, the very one that had connected them to the past, lay on the table between them. It was a symbol of what had been lost and what they were now fighting to reclaim. Emily was at school, Sarah having offered to take her that morning so that David and Logan could focus on the final push. David's mind, however, kept drifting to her safety. What if he goes after Emily? He asked, his voice breaking with fear. Logan placed a reassuring hand on David's shoulder. We've taken precautions. Sarah is keeping an eye on her, and I've hired extra security at the school. She's safe, David. But we need to focus on this now. David nodded, pushing down the fear as best as he could. You're right. Let's end this. The plan was set in motion later that afternoon. Logan had arranged a live interview with a reputable news station, giving them the exclusive story about David's abduction, Grayson's involvement, and the cover-up that had spanned decades. It was risky, but it was the most direct way to expose Grayson's crimes. David sat beside Logan in the dimly lit studio, feeling a mix of anxiety and hope. The reporter, a seasoned journalist named Carol Simmons, sat across from them, her face serious but sympathetic. This is a big story, she said, adjusting her notes. Are you both ready for what comes next? Logan looked at David, then back at Carol. We're ready. The camera's red light blinked on, signaling that they were live. Carol's voice was steady as she introduced the story. Today, we have an extraordinary revelation. A story of a man lost to his family for over 3 decades, of power, greed, and a truth buried deep. We bring you the story of David Monroe, a man whose past was stolen and who has now returned to claim justice. David felt his heart pounding in his chest as he began to speak. For years, I didn't know who I was. I was taken from my family, stripped of my identity, and forced to grow up without knowing the truth. But now I know what happened, and I want the world to know too. Logan picked up from there, his voice filled with controlled anger. Victor Grayson orchestrated David's kidnapping to secure his control over the Bennett family's fortune. He used every resource at his disposal to keep this secret, and he's continued to threaten us as we've tried to bring the truth to light. As the broadcast continued, David felt a strange sense of liberation. Speaking the truth, even to a room full of strangers, lifted a weight that had been pressing on him for as long as he could remember. He saw the intensity in Carol's eyes as she listened, knowing that the story was about to explode beyond this small studio. Meanwhile, back at Grayson's mansion, chaos was unfolding. He stood in front of a television, his face twisted with fury as the live broadcast played out. Turn it off, he ordered his assistant, but it was too late. The damage was done. The truth was spreading. Grayson's phone rang, a call from one of his most trusted associates. "Victor, it's bad," the voice on the other end said urgently. "The press is all over it, and there's already talk of an investigation. You need to move fast." Grayson's eyes burned with a cold rage. "They won't get away with this," he hissed. "They have no idea who they're dealing with." He ended the call and turned to one of his security personnel. "Get the car ready. We're going to end this tonight." As the interview concluded, Logan and David felt a surge of hope. But it was short-lived. Logan's phone buzzed with a message from one of his security contacts. "Grayson's on the move," the message read. "He's coming for you." David felt a chill run down his spine. "He's not backing down," he said, his voice filled with a mix of dread and determination. Logan's eyes were hard. "Let him come. We're ready." That evening, the atmosphere was tense at David's house. Sarah had brought Emily home safely, but the tension was palpable. David and Logan had taken every precaution, setting up surveillance and securing the house as best they could. But they both knew that if Grayson was truly desperate, nothing would stop him. Just after sunset, headlights appeared at the end of the street. A black SUV rolled slowly toward the house, its windows tinted. David's heart raced as he watched the car approach, feeling a sense of impending danger. "He's here," he said quietly. Logan grabbed a gun from the table, his face set with grim determination. "Stay with Emily," he told David. "I'll handle this." But David shook his head. "No, we do this together." They stepped outside, standing side by side as the SUV pulled up. The doors opened and Grayson stepped out, flanked by two of his men. His face was a mask of cold fury, but there was also a hint of desperation in his eyes. "You've made a grave mistake," Grayson said, his voice low and menacing. "You think you can ruin me? You have no idea what you're up against." David took a step forward, his voice steady. "No, Grayson, you made the mistake when you took me from my family. And now it's over." Grayson's men moved forward, but Logan raised his gun, his voice sharp. "Back off or I swear I'll shoot." For a moment, the tension was unbearable, the two sides locked in a standoff. Then, suddenly, police sirens blared in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Grayson's face twisted with anger as he realized what was happening. "You called the cops," he snarled. David's eyes were unwavering. "The truth is out, Grayson. It's over." Within moments, squad cars surrounded the house, officers rushing out to secure the area. Grayson's men tried to resist, but they were quickly overpowered and handcuffed. Grayson himself was forced to the ground, his hands behind his back, his face filled with a mix of rage and defeat. As he was led away, he turned back to David, his voice filled with venom. "You think you've won? This isn't the end." David's voice was calm, resolute. "No, but it's the end for you." As the police cars drove away, David felt a wave of relief wash over him. The battle was finally over. Logan stood beside him, his face a mix of exhaustion and pride. "We did it," he said softly. David nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and newfound hope. "We did." Inside, Emily ran up to David, her arms wrapping tightly around his waist. "Daddy, are the bad guys gone?" David knelt down, his eyes meeting hers. "Yes, sweetheart, they're gone, and we're safe now." Emily's eyes were filled with innocence and trust. "Good. I was scared." David hugged her tightly, feeling tears welling up. "I know, Em, but you don't have to be scared anymore." As he held his daughter, the weight of the past finally lifted, replaced by a sense of closure he had never thought possible. He looked over at Logan, a silent understanding passing between them. The road ahead was still uncertain, but they would face it together as brothers. For the first time in a long time, the future felt like it belonged to them. The days following Victor Grayson's arrest were a whirlwind. The news of his downfall spread quickly, and the media was relentless. Headlines screamed about the decades-long conspiracy, the kidnapping that had shattered a family, and the resilience of a man who had returned to reclaim his stolen identity. It was both overwhelming and cathartic for David. As he stepped outside one morning, the crisp autumn air greeted him. It was a rare moment of quiet. No reporters, no police, just the soft sound of leaves rustling in the wind. He looked up at the sky, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. For the first time, he felt a sense of freedom. Inside, Logan sat at the kitchen table, reading through the latest news article about the case. His eyes were filled with a mix of satisfaction and exhaustion. "It's all over the place," he said, glancing up at David. "They're calling you the lost brother who fought back." David gave a small, weary smile. "I never thought I'd be a headline." Logan nodded, understanding. "You didn't ask for any of this, but you faced it head-on, David. You got the truth out there." David's smile faded a bit as he glanced toward the hallway where Emily was getting ready for school. "I just want her to have a normal life now," he said quietly. Logan's gaze softened. "She will, David. You've made sure of that." The following week, the town held a community gathering in honor of David and Logan, celebrating the end of a long chapter and the beginning of a new one. The local park, usually a quiet place, was filled with people, neighbors, friends, and even some strangers who had been moved by the story. As David and Logan stepped onto the small stage set up for the event, a hush fell over the crowd. It was a surreal moment for David, who had spent so much of his life trying to avoid attention. Now, he stood before everyone, not as a mystery, but as a man who had found his way back to the truth. Mayor Collins, a stout, kindly man with a booming voice, spoke into the microphone. "Today, we honor the courage and determination of David Monroe, a man who fought against all odds to find justice. And we also celebrate the reunion of two brothers, torn apart by tragedy, but brought back together by their will to uncover the truth." The crowd erupted in applause, the sound overwhelming David for a moment. He felt Logan's hand on his shoulder, steadying him. It was a gesture of support, a reminder that they had done this together. David stepped forward, taking a deep breath before speaking into the microphone. "Thank you," he began, his voice raw with emotion. "I never thought I'd be standing here, not like this. For years, I didn't know who I was or where I came from. I was lost. But today, I'm here with my brother and with my daughter, knowing exactly who I am. I'm not just David Monroe. I'm also David Bennett." There was a murmur of surprise in the crowd, followed by more applause. David continued, his voice stronger now. "But this isn't just about me. It's about all of us, about the importance of truth, no matter how long it takes to find it. Thank you for standing with us, for believing in us, and for helping us close this chapter." As he stepped back, Logan moved forward, taking his turn at the microphone. "There's one more thing I want to say," he said, his voice filled with both gravity and hope. "This journey was never just about justice. It was about family. And today, I can finally say that my brother is back where he belongs." The crowd cheered, the sound echoing through the park. It was a moment of closure, not just for David and Logan, but for everyone who had followed their story. Later, as the sun began to set, David found himself sitting on a bench near the edge of the park, watching Emily play with some other children. She was laughing, chasing a group of kids around the swings, her blonde hair glowing in the golden light. Sarah sat down beside David, her expression warm. "She's so happy," she observed. "You did it, David." David nodded, his eyes still on Emily. "I couldn't have done it without you, Sarah. You were there from the beginning." Sarah smiled, nudging him playfully. "Well, I wasn't going to let you face this alone." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of the past slowly lifting. "So, what's next for you?" Sarah asked, her voice gentle. David thought for a moment, feeling a strange but welcome sense of possibility. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've spent so much time searching for the past, I haven't really thought about the future." Sarah's eyes twinkled. "Maybe it's time you did." David turned to look at her, the sincerity in her eyes warming him. "Maybe it is," he agreed. In the following weeks, life began to settle into a new kind of normal. David returned to the garage, the familiar scent of oil and grease bringing a sense of comfort. The townspeople treated him differently now. No longer just the quiet mechanic, but a man who had fought for his family and won. Yet, they respected his desire for privacy, giving him space to rebuild his life at his own pace. Logan, meanwhile, found a new role for himself in the town. He became involved in local charities, using his resources to help disadvantaged families and children. It was his way of honoring the brother he had lost and found again. He visited David and Emily often, their bond stronger than ever. One evening, as David tucked Emily into bed, she looked up at him with a serious expression. "Daddy, are we really safe now?" David felt a familiar pang of protectiveness, but this time it was softened by certainty. "Yes, Em," he said softly. "We really are." Emily's eyes sparkled. "Good, because I don't want any more bad guys." David kissed her forehead, feeling tears prick at the corners of his eyes. "Neither do I, sweetheart." The following weekend, David and Logan visited the cemetery where their mother was buried. It was a quiet, somber place, but there was a sense of peace in the air. They stood together by the simple headstone, the cool breeze rustling the nearby trees. "I wish she could see us now," Logan said quietly, his voice filled with a mix of sadness and hope. David nodded, his eyes fixed on the name carved into the stone. "I think she can." They stood in silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. It wasn't closure in the traditional sense. There was still so much they couldn't get back. But there was peace, the kind that came from knowing the truth and finally being together. "We have a lot of lost time to make up for," Logan said, breaking the silence. David smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. "Yeah, we do. But we've got the rest of our lives to do it." Logan nodded, his eyes filled with a quiet determination. "And we will." As they walked back to the car, side by side, David felt a profound sense of calm. He had come full circle, not just in finding his family, but in finding himself. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, he knew that this was only the beginning of a new, brighter chapter. With Victor Grayson's arrest widely reported, the investigations began to intensify. The media followed closely as more evidence surfaced. Bribes, threats, and decades of manipulation to keep David's disappearance covered up. Grayson's empire was crumbling, and former allies started being dragged into the center of the scandal. David and Logan watched everything closely, knowing that the path to justice was advancing. But even with the mounting evidence and Grayson facing a series of charges, they knew the danger hadn't completely vanished. Men like Grayson don't surrender easily. One afternoon, while David was working on a customer's car at the back of his garage, he received a call from Claire Matthews, the private investigator who had been crucial to exposing the case. "David," Claire's voice was tense, filled with urgency. "I just got a tip from a trusted contact. Someone paid a large sum to a hitman, and the target is you and Logan." David felt a chill run down his spine. "Are you sure?" "Unfortunately, yes," she confirmed. "The orders are clear. Do whatever it takes to make sure you don't speak again. If I were you, I'd reinforce your security." David hung up, his heart pounding. He couldn't risk Emily's life, not after everything they'd been through. He quickly grabbed his phone and called Logan, who was downtown handling legal matters related to the case. "Logan, we need to meet now," David said, urgency in his voice. "Is there a problem?" Logan asked, already suspecting the answer wouldn't be good. "Claire got a tip. It looks like Grayson has one last card to play," David explained. "We need to prepare for the worst." That night, David, Logan, and Sarah gathered at David's house. The atmosphere was tense. Everyone knew the final confrontation was near. Emily, sensing the heavy mood, stayed close to Sarah, who tried to keep her distracted while the brothers discussed strategies. "We can't just sit and wait for them to come to us," Logan said, his voice firm. "If they're determined to silence us, we need to make them think we're ready to fight back." David nodded, frustration evident on his face. "But we can't risk Emily and Sarah's safety. We need to get them to a safe place." Sarah, listening to the conversation, intervened. "I can take Emily to my parents' house for a few days. They live out of town, and no one knows the location." David hesitated, his protective instincts conflicting with the logic of the plan. "Are you sure it's safe?" Sarah looked directly into David's eyes, her voice soft but resolute. "I promise to take care of her, and you need to handle this without worrying about us." David finally agreed, though concern still lingered. "Thank you, Sarah. I trust you." With Emily and Sarah safely away, David and Logan prepared for the final confrontation. They relocated to a temporary hideout on the outskirts of town, an abandoned warehouse Logan had previously used to store security equipment. It was a discreet spot, ideal for waiting out the attack. "If they're really coming for us," Logan said, checking the security cameras they had set up around the perimeter, "we'll be ready." The hours passed slowly, the silence only broken by the occasional distant sound of wind rattling the warehouse doors. Then, around midnight, David heard a strange noise, stealthy footsteps approaching from outside. He and Logan exchanged a quick glance before taking their positions, ready for whatever was coming. Suddenly, the sound of a muffled explosion filled the air as the warehouse door was forced open. 3 armed men burst in, their silhouettes barely visible in the dim light of the warehouse. "Don't move," one of them shouted, his gun aimed directly at Logan. David and Logan didn't hesitate. They had anticipated this moment, and they were ready. A frantic shootout erupted, gunfire echoing through the warehouse. Driven by a mix of fear and determination, David quickly charged forward, knocking one of the men down before he could react. Logan, with calculated precision, managed to disarm one of the remaining attackers, while David immobilized the last one. The fight was intense but brief. Grayson's men hadn't expected to encounter such prepared resistance. "You think this is over?" one of the attackers muttered, even as he was restrained. "Grayson won't give up. He'll hunt you down to the end." Still catching his breath, David looked directly into the man's eyes. Grayson's already lost, and now he knows it. The next day, police arrested the 3 men who had attacked the warehouse, and they quickly confirmed they had been hired by Victor Grayson. This added even more weight to the charges against him, sealing his fate once and for all. Logan, with a relieved smile, looked at David. "We did it, brother. It's over." David nodded. An enormous weight finally lifted from his shoulders. "Yes, it is." In the following weeks, Victor Grayson's trial became a media spectacle. With all the evidence presented, he was convicted of conspiracy, kidnapping, and attempted murder, receiving a long prison sentence. It was the end of an era of lies and manipulation. David, Logan, Emily, and Sarah were finally able to breathe in peace. There were no more secrets, no more threats lurking in the shadows. And as they gathered for a simple dinner at David's house, laughing and telling stories, everything felt incredibly normal, like a family, the way it should have been from the start. "Daddy," Emily said, tugging at David's sleeve, "now that everything's okay, can we go to the park tomorrow?" David smiled, his heart light for the first time in a long while. "Of course, Em. We'll go to the park." As the evening wore on, David and Logan shared a quiet toast. It was more than a toast to their victory over Grayson. It was a toast to the future, to the lost time that would finally start to be reclaimed, and to the promise of a peaceful life now truly within reach. "To new beginnings," Logan said, raising his glass. "To new beginnings," David repeated, a genuine smile lighting up his face. And so, amidst the laughter and warmth of their reunited family, they closed the final chapter of a story marked by pain, but also by hope and redemption.